Joining us to discuss the latest in U.S.-Iran negotiations is Rod D. Martin, geopolitical analyst and the CEO of Martin Capital. Good to have you with us, Rod. President Trump said this morning, as we just heard, that Iran had requested a new meeting with the U.S. What could Iran bring to the table that would help ensure the ceasefire continues after several days of military exchanges?
Honestly, they really can't. I mean, this is an incredibly divided government. We had an incident on Saturday. 63 of 88 members of the so-called Assembly of Experts, which is the mullahs who pick ayatollahs. You know, they're the religious body that oversees the government. 63 of 88 of them declared basically a fatwa on Netanyahu and Trump and called for all Muslims whatsoever who could possibly get within reach to kill them. These guys are feeling sold out by the faction of their government that is negotiating with the great Satan. And so you've got this internal rift that every single day that passes, Trump is exacerbating. He is making it worse. He is turning these guys against each other. So what can the Iranians do? Well, they can keep doing dumb stuff because the factions that are with the Assembly of Experts are out there, firing on tankers. And then you've got the other guys who are actually trying to get a deal because they know the country's being ruined by this bombing, and they're fighting each other. The main faction technically in control right now is seen as sellouts by the mullahs, and that cannot end well for them.
All right, let's look more closely at what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz and the outpouring of events from there. Oil prices began dropping immediately after the U.S. and Iran signed the 60-day ceasefire agreement. That was about a week and a half ago, of course. But now that the ceasefire seems to be a little more fragile, how could that impact pressure, economic and otherwise, on both sides?
In the short term, there can be some variability. I wouldn't be surprised by that at all. In the long term, this is one of Trump's key aims that kind of went unspoken in this war. The Strait of Hormuz has been a pressure point the Iranians could at least threaten for basically your and my whole lifetime. And all of a sudden, that's changing. Within 2 years, the Strait of Hormuz will be effectively irrelevant. The development of UAE pipeline capacity across Oman to the Arabian Sea, Saudi capacity to the Red Sea, potentially pipelines to the Mediterranean, no one's going to need the Strait of Hormuz. So Iran has taken one of its greatest strengths and through this conflict turned it into a nothing burger. So yes, in the short term, you might have some volatility, but the truth is the fact that WTI is at $69 a barrel tells you the story. We were supposed to be at 200 or 250, according to Trump's critics. And the truth is we're now under the price we were at on February 28th. It's only going to drop from here. And the less we are susceptible to attacks on the Strait of Hormuz because of that new pipeline construction, because of the U.S. Navy, the more prices are going to drop. That's that risk premium that's been built into the price for the last 35 years that I've been talking to you about for a long time now, and it is beginning to go away.
Okay, looking at what you've said, maybe the functionality of continuing these negotiations being the internal destruction of the Iranian regime via its own mechanisms. But beyond that, President Trump also may like to end this conflict as soon as possible. We were just speaking with Captain James Fennell earlier this morning on the morning show.
Who is awesome.
Yes, and he gave his opinions here on this topic, saying that Iran may actually fear Treasury Secretary Bessent more than Secretary of War Pete Hegseth. At this point, he suggested using Iranian assets to compensate Gulf allies and ourselves for the expense of the war. What other economic levers does the U.S. now have?
This is a much bigger play than just Iran, as you and I have been discussing for a long time. And the truth of the matter is, this is about drying up cheap subsidized oil to China from the Russians, from the Iranians, from the Venezuelans. This is about creating those dollar swap credit facilities with key allies, including the UAE. The discussions on that are a big part of why the UAE left OPEC. We are systematically dismembering the mechanisms by which the West was previously held hostage in multiple Arab oil embargoes. And we are simultaneously pegging everybody to the dollar in a way where they're tied to it. And their opportunities are entirely dependent on good favor in Washington instead of begging the IMF. So it's just a tremendous structure that Scott Bessent has created here, certainly with Donald Trump's full participation and blessing. We are going to see a massively strengthened dollar when this is over, which dramatically diminishes Russia and China. We're also going to see much more secure supply. And of course, the most secure energy supply of all, and this helps the entire global economy dramatically, is U.S. supply. The more we can supply from the Gulf of America instead of the Persian Gulf, the more people can count on that supply, don't have to worry about somebody shooting at tankers, don't have to pay a risk premium. And by the way, stop enriching their enemies. Why is Europe buying energy from Russia or even Qatar? That's crazy. They should be buying it from Louisiana. And now they're going to be under the trade deal the EU finally got around to ratifying last week, which is just glorious. They're going to buy nearly $1 trillion in U.S. energy. They're going to cut their tariffs on industrial goods and other key products to about zero. There are a few things that will still have tariffs. And the U.S. has a 15% tariff on them to compensate for the trade barriers they aren't reducing. All of that makes Europe more secure, makes NATO more secure, and therefore makes us not only more secure, but actually richer. So that's all good too.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. But on China, you've mentioned, okay, so we know it's been a player behind the scenes, being a big customer of Iranian oil traditionally. But given their economic and otherwise partnership with Iran, what likeness, if any, do you see between the two regimes? And what lessons from that could the U.S. take to its negotiations with Iran?
Well, they're both totalitarian, and they're both completely disloyal. So, the Chinese have done virtually nothing for the Iranians during the 12-day war last year, during this conflict now. If anything, they have been obstructive in a lot of key ways for the Iranians because they are dependent on that oil. And they are the world's largest importer, and they can't not be the world's largest importer. So they've got to have a free flow of oil more than they've got to have their buddies in Tehran in good shape. They have done the same thing with the Iranians in some ways that they've done with the Russians, which has been an entirely predatory relationship where they are just draining the Russian treasury of gold in exchange for energy they're paying a fraction of the legitimate market price for, because of course it's illegally sanctioned. The Chinese can't buy this legitimately, but they're buying huge amounts of it. And Trump disrupting the shadow fleet, interdicting those tankers, changes all of that. So if the Chinese are forced to compete more evenly, they're paying the same price for energy everybody else is, they're prevented from dumping in the United States and hopefully soon Europe as well, the Chinese are in a much, much worse position economically than they were before this started.
Now, Rod, as a philosopher capitalist, as you're sometimes known, what do you see as the keys to rebuilding Iran if a deal can be reached and nuclear developments curtailed, or however it comes to the point of rebuilding?
Look, the most important thing is that Iran be free. If it's free, it can become a first world country in a generation. It can be an economic and global powerhouse in countless ways if it's not suffocated under this tyrannical totalitarian nightmare, which functions economically as a socialist regime, no different from Venezuela or Cuba. So that's the key. If the mullahs stay in power, and I really don't think they will, but if they do, Iran doesn't have a lot of a future. If they are overthrown and there's actually a free Iran, and those are two different things, the one does not necessarily result in the other, but if those things happen, Iran is going to be the greatest investment opportunity of the 2030s. And look, one of the ways you get there, and this is so important, and the president accomplished this last week in part, one of the most important things is that the Arab Gulf states understand that. They don't really want the Iranian regime gone because the Iranian regime is keeping Iran from being the biggest power in the region by being stupid, by running their economy so badly. And so if you had a free Iran, first of all, that might actually encourage people to want freedom in Arab countries as well. But the bigger thing is Iran would become a first world country. If you achieve that, you have changed the landscape. And what the president did last week that is transformative is this Lebanese peace deal. The Arabs have used the Palestinians as an excuse, even though they won't accept Palestinians into their countries. They know every time you do that, they try to overthrow the government wherever they're let in. You know, they don't like the Palestinians, but they're emotionally wedded to the cause. Same thing to a degree with Hezbollah. And Trump is systematically taking away the Arab excuses to oppose Israel, which results in a generalized peace at some point. Lebanon has been in an effective state of civil war since 1975. Most of your viewers weren't even born then, and it's largely because of outside forces, primarily Iranian, through Hezbollah, which is a non-state actor in control of about a third of Lebanon's sovereign territory. Lebanon is also in a state of war with Israel by its own choosing since 1948. They recognized Israeli sovereignty and territorial integrity last week in a signing ceremony presided over by Marco Rubio. This is an earthquake. In other news cycles, it would be the dominating news. And what it does is it takes away another one of those excuses for a broad regional peace.
Wow, so much to talk about here. Great to have you on. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much again, Rod D. Martin.
Great to be here.